My name is Camille. I am 31 years old. And the morning everything changed, I was sitting on a hard plastic chair in the lobby of the Hamilton County Family Courthouse, eating a granola bar I had pulled from a vending machine because I had not slept enough to remember breakfast. I had driven 4 hours from a project site in Cincinnati to be here by 8 a.m. My estranged husband had filed an emergency custody motion claiming I was an unfit mother, and my daughter's hearing was at 10. His attorney had sent me the paperwork at 11:59 the night before, giving me exactly 1 minute of legal notice before midnight. I was a licensed structural engineer. For 8 years I had investigated why buildings failed. I had testified before federal housing committees. I had shut down a construction project in Memphis that would have eventually collapsed on 300 people. I had spent my entire career finding the truth buried inside numbers and load calculations and safety reports that other engineers had deliberately falsified. And that morning my husband wanted a judge to believe I was too distracted by my work to be a mother. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had someone use your ambition as a weapon against you, as if loving your work meant you could not possibly love your child just as fiercely. The courthouse coffee cart was a folding table near the security checkpoint, with a percolator and a woman named Dot, who looked like she had been standing behind that cart since the Reagan administration. I got in line, ordered a black coffee, and was turning to find seat when I nearly walked into a man who was suddenly listing sideways against the wall. He was in his late 60s, well-dressed in a charcoal blazer, with a small American flag pin on the lapel, and his face had gone the particular shade of gray that I recognized because my grandfather had looked exactly the same the day he went into diabetic shock in our kitchen. This man's hands were trembling. His briefcase slipped from his fingers and hit the floor, scattering papers across the tile. Nobody moved. Lawyers walked around the mess. A clerk glanced over and went back to her phone. I set down my coffee and went straight to him. "Sir," I said, "I need you to sit down right now." He didn't argue. I guided him to the nearest chair, crouched down and looked at his face. Pale lips, shallow breathing. I turned toward the security desk. "I need orange juice or something sugary right now," I said clearly. "This man is hypoglycemic." The guard blinked at me. "Not tomorrow," I said. "Now please." He moved. While we waited, I gathered the papers off the floor. I stacked them without really trying to read them, but I am a person whose eyes move to numbers automatically. It is a professional reflex, the way a plumber walking through a restaurant notices a bad pipe fitting without meaning to. One page caught my attention before I could stop it. It was a structural compliance summary for a residential development project. The engineering on page 3 had an error in the shear wall load distribution that would cost the developer somewhere around $2 million to correct if a building inspector caught it during final certification. The guard came back with a juice box from the children's waiting area. The elderly man drank it slowly. The color returned to his face and his hands steadied. He looked at me with sharp, clear eyes. "I appreciate that," he said. "I thought I had managed it this morning." "I am just glad you're okay," I said and held out the stack of papers. He took them, glanced at the top page, and then looked back up at me. "You already saw the calculation error," he said. "It was not a question." "I wasn't trying to pry," I said. "It's a reflex." He smiled. "What kind of reflex?" "A structural engineer," I said. "Forensic analysis, mostly. I find what went wrong in buildings that failed." He studied me with an expression I couldn't quite name. Then he extended his hand. "My name is Edmund," he said, "a retired professor of civil engineering, just visiting some old colleagues today." I shook it. "Camille," I said. "Nice to meet you." He asked me to point out the error. I did, tracing the column on the page with my fingernail. He listened without interrupting, nodded once, and then said, "I have had 3 people review this file over the past 2 weeks. You are the first one who caught that." I told him it happened to be in my wheelhouse. He said, "What brings you to the courthouse today, Camille?" "A custody hearing," I said. "My husband filed an emergency motion last night." Something shifted in his expression just slightly. He looked at me for a moment, then he said, "I hope the truth finds the room it needs today." I thought it was just something polite to say. I thanked him, wished him well, and went to find a seat closer to the courtroom doors. I did not think about Edmund again for another 2 hours. My husband was already in the corridor when I came around the corner at 9:45. My husband Cade was 40 years old and 6'2" and wore his suits the way some men wear armor. He had the ease of someone who had never once walked into a room and wondered if he belonged there. His attorney Morris stood beside him holding a leather portfolio looking at his phone. Standing on my husband's other side was his girlfriend. She was 24. She had been his firm's interior designer. I had met her at the company Christmas party 2 years earlier, when she shook my hand and told me she admired my work ethic, and I had smiled and said thank you and thought nothing of it. She was holding a framed picture. I knew that frame. I had bought it at a craft store in February, a white wooden frame with small stars along the border. Inside it was a drawing my daughter had made for me on my birthday. She was 6 years old. She had drawn the two of us holding hands in front of what was supposed to be our house, with a sun that was almost bigger than the building, and a dog we did not own but that she had been asking about since she was 4. She had written Mama at the top in red crayon, the letters uneven and enormous, and I had kept that picture on my nightstand because I loved it more than anything I had accumulated in 31 years of living. His girlfriend was holding it against her chest like it belonged to her. I stopped walking. She saw me stop and she smiled. My husband turned and looked at me with the expression he always wore when he wanted to perform confidence in front of an audience. He spread his hands slightly, like a man who had already won something. "Camille," he said, "you actually came alone." "I did," I said. He looked past me, scanning the hallway behind me to confirm what he already knew. I had not been able to afford an attorney. He had frozen our joint accounts the morning after I filed, while I was on a project site in Dayton and couldn't get to a bank before the hold processed. His girlfriend stepped toward me, tilting the frame so I could see it more clearly. "Hazel gave this to me last weekend," she said. "She told me I was her favorite." The air in the corridor went thin. Hazel was my daughter. My 6-year-old daughter who had drawn that picture for my birthday with a red crayon and put Mama at the top because she wanted me to know she loved me even when I had to travel for work. I looked at the frame, I looked at her face. She said, "Cade thought it would be good for Hazel to have a stable mother figure, someone who is actually home. I want you to understand something about how I was trained to process information. When I walk into a building that has partially collapsed, the first thing I do is not panic. The first thing I do is observe. I look at where the failure started, how it progressed, and what the structure can still hold. I do not react to the damage, I assess it." I took a breath. I said, "That picture belongs to me. My daughter made it for my birthday. The frame came from my house. And if you do not put it down, I will add the theft of personal property to the list of things I am discussing with the judge this morning." Her smile faltered. Morris stepped smoothly forward and said that I was clearly under a great deal of stress, and perhaps I would be more comfortable waiting in the public seating area. I looked at him and said, "I'll wait wherever I choose to wait, and you might want to prepare something more substantial than stress, counselor, because that is not going to be enough today." My husband laughed. It was the laugh he used when he wanted other people to hear it, a loud performance of amusement calibrated to the acoustics of the space. He said, "You walked in here with no lawyer, no representation, and you think you're going to what exactly? You're going to lecture us?" I didn't answer. That was when I heard the tap of a cane on marble. I turned. Edmund was walking down the corridor with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who had never needed to rush, because rooms waited for him. He had straightened his tie, his briefcase was under his arm, his expression was composed and sharp and entirely unbothered. He came to stand beside me. My husband looked at him the way men like my husband look at elderly men who appear unexpectedly beside their opponents, with contempt wearing the costume of amusement. He looked at Edmund's cane and his neat blazer and the age in his face, and then he let out another laugh, louder this time, the kind designed to carry. He said, "Camille, did you bring your grandfather to hold your hand today?" Morris allowed himself a small smile. Edmund looked at my husband with the expression of a man who has heard that particular joke in various forms for decades and finds it neither clever nor worth addressing. He said pleasantly, "Good morning." Then he turned to me and said, "Shall we go in?" I want to tell you what I had done the night before that hearing, because it matters. For months, I had been reviewing documents that had passed through our shared home office during our marriage. My husband liked to talk about his projects at dinner. He liked showing me the design drawings, asking what I thought about load-bearing walls and foundation work, because it made him feel connected to the technical side of a business he didn't fully understand. I had looked at those drawings many times over 7 years. And the final compliance reports that got filed with the county, the ones that secured him his building permits, were different from those drawings. Subtly and cleverly different. The kind of different that a non-engineer would never detect. The kind of different that a forensic structural engineer who had spent 8 years catching exactly this kind of falsification would recognize in under 90 seconds. 3 of his residential buildings had been approved for occupancy using compliance reports I believed were falsified. 2 of those buildings had received funding through federal HUD programs. I had spent the night compiling everything into a binder. I printed the original design sketches he had shown me at our kitchen table, with time-stamped photographs I had taken on my phone of the drawings during our marriage, and the final filed reports I obtained from the county's public records database. I wrote a technical summary in plain language explaining where the numbers diverged and what that divergence meant for the people who lived in those buildings. I had also called the State Building Commissioner's office at 7:43 that morning and left a report with the duty officer. I did not know, when I sat down at the petitioner's table in courtroom 7 and placed my binder in front of me, that the State Building Commissioner Emeritus was already in the building. Judge Harmon was a compact man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead who entered without ceremony and sat down with the expression of someone with 40 minutes before lunch and no patience for wasted time. He looked at the petitioner's table. He looked at the respondent's table. He said, "I see the petitioner is self-represented today." "Yes, Your Honor," I said. He looked at me over his glasses and said, "That is your right. I'd caution you that family court proceedings have specific procedural requirements." Morris stood immediately, already smiling. He said, "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to address several matters before the petitioner wastes the court's time. Specifically, I'll be moving to strike any documents she gathered from my client's private business files and requesting sanctions for her breach of professional ethics." Judge Harmon said, "That's a significant allegation, Counselor. What's your basis?" Morris said, "My client maintained a dedicated home office for his development business. The petitioner accessed his proprietary structural reports without authorization using credentials that were revoked when the separation was initiated. Any evidence she gathered from those files is fruit of the poisonous tree, Your Honor, and must be excluded entirely." He slid a document across to the bailiff and added, "Additionally, my client has a signed statement from the children's school showing that Hazel experienced 4 absences in the past 2 months due to her mother's inability to arrange consistent childcare during work travel. We're requesting immediate transfer of primary custody to the respondents." He sat down. Judge Harmon looked at me. He said, "Ms. Camille, would you like to respond to the motion to exclude?" I said, "Yes, Your Honor. But I'd first like to request permission for my advisor to address the court on my behalf, in a pro hac vice capacity." He frowned. "You didn't list an advisor in your filings." "He agreed to assist me this morning," I said. "I'm formally requesting his participation now." From the front row of the gallery I heard the sound of a cane on the floor, the small wooden gate to the courtroom well opened, and Edmund walked in. I don't know how to explain what happened to Judge Harmon's face in a way that does it justice. It was not gradual. It was the way a light changes when a switch is flipped. The reading glasses came off his forehead entirely. He sat forward. His voice, when he spoke, was the voice of a man choosing every word with care. He said, "Commissioner Edmund Falk." Edmund said simply, "Good morning, Your Honor." Morris turned his head slowly. I watched him take in the elderly man standing beside me. I watched the recognition arrive. I watched the color leave his face in a way I found, professionally speaking, deeply satisfying. Edmund Falk had served as State Building Commissioner for 19 years. He had written the structural safety codes tested on every licensed engineer in the state. He served on the Federal Housing Safety Commission. the body responsible for auditing developments built with HUD and FHA funds. He was also a sitting member of the State Professional Engineering Licensing Board, the same board that investigated misconduct by licensed engineers. The same board that could investigate me. The same board that, as it turned out, could investigate everyone in that room. My husband leaned toward Morris and whispered something urgent. Morris did not respond. He was looking at Edmund with the expression of a man watching the bridge he already crossed collapse behind him. Judge Harmon said, "Commissioner Falk, the court recognizes you and grants your request to serve as advisor to the petitioner. Please note your participation for the record." Edmund nodded. He placed his hands on the table beside me with the calm of someone settling in for a conversation he has been waiting to have. He looked at Morris and said pleasantly, "Please continue with your motion, counselor. We are listening very carefully." Morris stood again. The confidence was still there on the surface, the way paint remains on a wall that has already started cracking underneath. He said, "Your Honor, the respondent maintains that the petitioner accessed proprietary company files in violation of my client's reasonable expectation of privacy in a dedicated business workspace." Edmund said, without raising his voice, "I'd like to submit one document for the court's consideration before you rule on that motion, Your Honor." He reached into his briefcase and handed a single page to me. I carried it to the bailiff. Edmund said, "What the court is looking at is a provision of the Professional Engineers Act, Title 45, establishing that a licensed structural engineer who encounters credible evidence of falsified safety reports submitted to a federal housing program has a mandatory duty to report that evidence to the appropriate authority. That obligation is not discretionary. It supersedes state-level privacy claims." The petitioner did not go searching for fraud in her husband's files. She encountered documents she was professionally obligated to assess when they passed through their shared residence during the marriage. Her obligation to act on what she found is a matter of federal professional ethics law, not a privacy violation. Morris said, "Your Honor." Edmund said, "Furthermore, 2 of the 3 residential developments in question received funding through HUD programs, which places them under federal jurisdiction. The State Building Commissioner's Office received the petitioner's report this morning. That report has already been escalated to our federal counterparts. The privacy argument Mr. Morris is advancing is a civil claim. It does not function as a shield against a mandatory federal reporting obligation. It never has." He stopped. He looked at the judge. He said, "But of course the motion is yours to rule on." The room was very quiet. Judge Harmon read the document once, then he read it again. Then he said, "The motion to exclude is denied. The petitioner's binder is admitted into the court record in full." My husband made a sound at the respondent's table. It was not a word. It was the sound a structure makes just before failure, that sudden release of pressure from something that has been held under load for too long. Judge Harmon said, "I'd like the respondent to take the stand." My husband looked at Morris. Morris looked at the table. My husband walked to the witness box and took his seat. He raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth under penalty of perjury, and I thought about how a person can stand in a room and make that promise, and still not fully understand that the room has already changed around them. I stood and faced him. I want to tell you what that moment felt like, because it was not what I expected. For 3 months I had been running on the specific kind of cold, focused anger that has no room for anything else. I had worked 14-hour days on project sites and come home, and spent the nights going through records. I had missed Hazel's school play because I was at a county records office pulling permit filings at 6 in the evening. I had cried exactly once in my car in a parking lot off Route 32, and then I had gone back inside and kept working. Standing there looking at him in the witness box, I did not feel angry anymore. I felt very clear. I said, "In the structural compliance report for the Millbridge Terrace project, filed with Hamilton County on March 14th, the shear wall load calculation on page 7 shows a distribution ratio of 0.78. Is that the figure your engineering team submitted?" He said, "I don't personally review every technical document that comes through the firm." I said, "You brought that design drawing home on February 3rd. You showed it to me at our kitchen table and asked whether the foundation would hold for the additional floor you wanted to add. Do you remember that conversation? He said, I may have discussed some general concepts at some point. I said, I photographed that drawing on my phone that same evening because I wanted to look at it more carefully. The load calculation on that drawing is 0.64. The filing that received permit approval 3 weeks later shows 0.78. Can you explain the difference? The silence went on long enough that I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I said, I have the photograph timestamped to February 3rd. I have the county filing timestamp to February 22nd. I have a technical analysis showing the figure was changed after the preliminary design was finalized, in a way that would allow the project to pass county review without the additional foundation reinforcement your own engineer originally specified. His jaw tightened, his hands on the railing of the witness box tightened around it. He said, any modifications to the technical documents would have been handled by the engineering firm we contracted. I said, the engineering firm you contracted was contacted by the State Building Commissioner's office this morning. Their project file is now under review. I turned to face the judge. I said, Your Honor, I am not here today to litigate the construction fraud. That is now in the hands of the appropriate state and federal authorities. What I am here to tell this court is that the man who filed an emergency motion at midnight, claiming I am an unfit mother, has been operating 3 residential buildings that may be structurally unsafe, that 2 of those buildings were built with federal housing funds, and that he chose to file an emergency custody motion the moment he understood I was close to finding what I found. I opened my binder to the last section. I said, the school attendance record that Counselor Morris submitted shows 4 absences. 3 of those 4 occurred during weeks when Hazel was in her father's care. The one absence during my parenting time was because she had strep throat. I kept her home and took her to the pediatrician, which is documented here. I passed the page to the bailiff. I said my work travel schedule for the past 6 months shows an average of 6 days per month on site. The remaining weeks I was home. I am submitting a statement from my employer confirming that schedule. A statement from Hazel's teacher describing her as a happy and well-adjusted child who talks about her mother frequently. And a letter from the neighbor who provides after-school care on my travel days, confirming that Hazel has consistent and loving supervision. I closed the binder. I said, this motion was not filed because anyone was worried about my daughter's welfare. It was filed to prevent me from being here today with what I know. I'd like the court to see that clearly. Judge Harmon looked at my husband in the witness box for a long, unhurried moment. Then he looked at Morris. He said, Counselor, is there anything your client would like to add before I issue my ruling? Morris said very quietly, No, Your Honor. What happened next took about 8 minutes. Judge Harmon awarded me primary residential custody of Hazel, with a structured visitation schedule contingent on the outcome of the ongoing state and federal investigations. He froze the marital assets pending a full financial accounting by a court-appointed forensic team. He awarded me attorney's fees converted to an hourly equivalent based on my professional credentials, noting that a licensed forensic engineer, who spent 3 months preparing legal documentation, was not the same as an unrepresented layperson. He requested a copy of my binder for the court record and ordered it forwarded to the County Housing Authority. He did not use dramatic language, he just read his ruling in a level, measured voice that left no room for interpretation. When it was over, Morris said something quiet into my husband's ear and left through the side door without looking back. My husband sat at the respondent's table for a moment after the room cleared, his hands flat on the surface in front of him. Then he looked at me, and the arrogance was gone, and what was left looked smaller than I expected. He said, You didn't have to do this way. I said, You filed an emergency custody motion at midnight claiming I was unfit to raise our daughter. I did this exactly the right way. He said, his voice dropping, I could lose everything. I said, Cade, you falsified safety reports on buildings where families live. You should have thought about what you could lose before you did that. I picked up my binder, I picked up my bag. I walked out. Edmund was waiting in the corridor. He had his cane and his briefcase and the composed expression of a man who had known how the morning would end before it began. He said, "Well done." I said I could not have done the legal piece without you. He said, "You had already done everything that mattered before I walked into that courtroom. I just handed the court permission to see it." We walked out of the building together into mid-morning light that was sharp and clean the way Ohio light gets in November when the sky is very blue. He handed me a card. His name was printed at the top and below it, Federal Housing Safety Commission Senior Investigator Emeritus. He said, "We need people who can read what you read and explain it to rooms that don't speak the language. Think about it. Call me when Hazel is settled." I said I would. Then I drove to her school and signed her out early, and took her to the place on Vine Street with the strawberry ice cream she had been requesting since July. She sat across from me in the booth, with a pink mustache, and told me about a game she had invented at recess that involved dragons and a scoring system so complex that only she fully understood it, and I listened to every single word. That evening, after she was asleep, I stood in my kitchen and looked at the framed picture that had been returned to me by the end of the afternoon. Mama, red crayon. Uneven letters that I loved more than anything. I set it on the windowsill where I could see it from the sink. 6 months later, I had a desk in the Columbus Regional Office of the Federal Housing Safety Commission, with a window that looked out over a courtyard where someone had planted a small garden that nobody had planned for, but everyone was glad was there. My title was Senior Forensic Consultant. I traveled less than before because the work centered on review and analysis, and when I did travel, I had enough flexibility to arrange things properly for Hazel. She was doing well. She had a dog now, a brown mutt from the Franklin County shelter she had named Professor, who occupied 3/4 of her bed and appeared to consider this a reasonable arrangement. The email from Edmund arrived on a Tuesday morning, brief the way all his messages were. The subject line read, "Final disposition." The Millbridge Terrace project had been halted pending structural remediation. Both HUD-funded developments were under full federal audit. The engineering firm had cooperated extensively with investigators, producing documentation of a pattern that stretched further back than anyone initially suspected. My husband's development firm had been suspended. He was facing federal wire fraud charges. His mother, who had spent months calling anyone who would listen about the injustice being done to her son, had been formally cautioned for attempting to contact Judge Harmon outside of proceedings. She had stopped returning most calls. His girlfriend had posted something on social media about focusing on her healing journey. She did not mention the penthouse lease that had been canceled when the marital assets were frozen, or the company card that had stopped working 2 days after the hearing. I read the email twice, then I closed it and went back to the file in front of me. A residential development in Toledo, 14 stories, HUD-assisted, with load calculations on the 3rd floor that did not match the soil compaction data from the original site assessment. I picked up my pencil. There is something I know about structures that I think is also true about people. A building does not fail all at once. It fails slowly, through small compromises made in places where no one is looking, through calculations adjusted just enough to pass review, through the assumption that no one will check carefully enough to notice. The failure was always there in the original numbers. You just have to know what to look for. My husband had spent years believing the things he built could hold whatever weight he placed on them. He never thought to ask someone who actually knew how to run the numbers. I had a daughter who believed dragons were real and that strawberry ice cream solved most problems, and a dog named Professor who had established squatters' rights on a 6-year-old's bed, and a window that looked out over a garden nobody planned but everyone needed. That was more than enough. That was everything.